Well, good evening and welcome to this next in the series of Ecclesiastical Law Bitesize. This evening we're looking at the Anglican Communion. First, I'd like to introduce Darren Oliver. Darren, could you just tell us, I've just said your name, but what do you do within the Church of England?
Good evening, Bishop. Good evening, everyone. I'm Darren Oliver. I'm a solicitor and a partner in the firm of Winkworth Sherwood. And I've been practicing in ecclesiastical law for more than a decade. My proper functions are as Registrar of the Diocese of Chichester, Registrar of the Diocese of Oxford, and Registrar of the Province of Canterbury. But as an aside, I'm also legal advisor to the Anglican Consultative Council.
So a little bit to keep you busy. So the Anglican Consultative Council, what then is an Anglican?
Good question. Well, defining the Anglican Communion sounds like it should be relatively easy. In modern worldwide church affairs, it's a fixed feature of Christian culture and ecumenism. But as I thought of the simplest and most straightforward way of discussing it for these purposes, the more complex it became. And that's because the Anglican Communion, in typical tongue-in-cheek speak, is very Anglican in evading fixed definition. It's been left intentionally fuzzy throughout its history and development. And the easiest way of addressing what it is to break it down a bit. And in doing so, I've drawn heavily on the assistance of the published Nairobi Caro proposals, which I'll mention further. And because of the need to check back on how we got here, I hope you'll forgive me for giving you some quotations as part of my answers. So, what does it mean to be Anglican? Well, one could be forgiven for immediately saying it means English, England, the Church of England. And the Latin phrase Ecclesia Anglicana was used very early on in the history of the Christian Church in England and was mentioned in Magna Carta of 1215. The Church of England is inherently Anglican. And in etymological terms, it's right that it means all England. But I would suggest the ablative tense is perhaps more correct, and it should mean from England. It'd be wrong to suggest that the origins of Anglicanism in ecclesiological terms don't have their roots in the Church of England, with the more tangential reference in the case of some Episcopal churches like Scotland and even the United States. But being, as it was, caught up in the evangelization of the British state around the world, the heritage of the Church of England is inescapable. It's useful, therefore, to use the Anglican identifier as a reminder that historically, many modern Anglican churches had their roots in the Church of England, and all that it was, especially in the 19th century. History is important in establishing something of the character of what it means to be Anglican. For many Anglican churches around the world, there is historic connection with the See or Archbishop of Canterbury. And for many, this has been about communion with the See or Archbishop of Canterbury, and through that, the Church of England. The history of the Anglican Communion is the story of the emergence of a family of churches broadly born of common parentage in England, marked by a shared inheritance around the Protestant Reformation and the Elizabethan settlement for the Church of England. And following the first gathering of Anglican bishops as the Lambeth Conference in 1897, an unplanned pattern of explosive missionary growth followed on, and the Anglican Communion has continually sought to develop support structures for this, while also protecting the autonomy of the resultant churches. It probably wasn't intended, but this historic connection through the first See of the Anglican Communion in Canterbury stands now as a symbol of the apostolic character of the Anglican Communion. But being Anglican today is about more than a historic connection to Canterbury, and it need not have very much to do with any modern connection to Canterbury, much less so the Church of England. In the context of disagreements and conflicting views, socially and doctrinally, it might be said that there is more about Anglican identity which can still serve to unite rather than divide. There are still elements of commonality which make churches Anglican as opposed to anything else. This derives from history as an inheritance of tradition and pattern, but also from local development and context. While many churches might owe their origins to the Church of England, They were forced by their own political circumstances to adopt their own constitutions and forms of authority. Over time, then, Anglicanism began to look quite different from the Church of England. The churches of the Anglican Communion share a history of common prayer and common mission, nourished by a rich theological inheritance, initially at least, laying claim to the liturgical and doctrinal pattern of the Church of England, enshrined in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, the 39 Articles, and the Ordinal. The Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops in 1930 affirmed the principle of autonomy of particular churches based upon a common faith and order. And in keeping with Article 34 of the Traditions of the Church, Anglican churches share a rich inheritance of Catholic and Apostolic faith and order, noting, to quote that article, "At all times they have been diverse and may be changed according to the diversities of countries and times." The point is, the exact form of our traditions and ceremonies are not binding between us as Anglicans, but the inherited principles of them can mutate to better meet the needs of particular peoples. In exploring part of that order, studies have been made in 2008 and 2022 of a number of Anglican churches' constitutions and canons to see whether there are principles of canon law common to the churches of the Anglican Communion, published under the same name, most recently, of course, under the aegis of the Ecclesiastical Law Society. That bore some success, but it's clear that in some areas, canon law is not a point of universal unity. Unsurprisingly, given the historic development of the churches of the Communion, rooted as many have been in the Church of England, the form and content, the structure and mission of their canon law is remarkably similar. But Anglicanism has never been static, and it's never been the same in every place and time. Whether the beginnings of Anglicanism in the global sense are found with the first English chaplains serving abroad in the 17th century, or the first Lambeth Conference in 1897, it was nonetheless, by the end of the 19th century, still primarily an English phenomenon. It was the aftermath of that conference which saw Anglicanism really take form as expressions of local church and context. And in 1912, Archbishop William Temple said that the church would change through its contact with different cultures. Unity, therefore, didn't imply uniformity, and in fact, through that principle, it might be said that Anglicanism as a movement depended on the diversity of its parts.
So that's the Anglican thing. But what about the communion part? What does it mean to be a communion?
Well, our understanding of communion and its non-absolute form these days is borrowed from our ecumenical dialogue. It comes from koinonia, which is generally seen as something to do with sharing and uniting. It's not necessarily binary of being in or out of something, but it is about several interconnected aspects and commitments that can be shared with others in varying degrees. And that echoes the sentiment in Vatican II that even baptized believers can be in an imperfect communion with the Catholic Church, noting that there are varying degrees of difference which are an obstacle to full communion. The term Anglican Communion was first used from the 1850s, when the first colonial churches became autonomous provinces. And the organisation of those churches into the development of a communion really took off, as I've said, from the Lambeth Conference in 1897. Criticism or concern about today's Anglican Communion is that Anglican churches with significant differences in what some see as central doctrinal matters and with no central authority to bind them together are nothing more than a loose federation of individual churches. And there's some truth in that. The churches of the Communion are entirely autonomous, and that is a crucial part of our Anglican identity too. Communion's not about gathering around an Anglican Pope. The 2008 and then the 2022 Lambeth Conferences refer to the Communion as a family of churches, and which family does not have its differences? Drawing on the encouragement in Ephesians to make every effort to keep unity in the bond of peace, the Nairobi-Cairo proposals describe that relationship in this way. Refusing to give up on those with whom we differ means pressing into renewed love when the world would have us walk away. a dogged refusal to give up on each other, to remain in relationship despite deep and significant disagreement, can be a remarkable witness to the power of Christ to bring unity in a divided world. Going back a little bit, the World Council of Churches in 2013 suggested that full communion includes communion to the fullness of apostolic faith, in sacramental life, in a truly one and mutually recognised ministry, in structures of conciliar relations and decision-making, and in common witness and service in the world. We have to ask, to what extent is that ever achievable, let alone present-day reality? And the phrase, to the highest degree of communion possible, has become familiar and was developed within the Anglican Communion around debates about the ordination of women. It's seen as a summons to respect the decision and attitudes of other provinces, without such respect necessarily indicating acceptance of the principles. Again, that autonomous nature being essential. The Anglican Church would be an overgeneralization of oneness. It is a body with many parts. And the 1920 Lambeth Conference emphasised the importance of episcopacy as the best instrument for maintaining the unity and continuity of the Church. And episcopal ordination was important for a common fellowship, a common ministry, and a common service to the world. And that, I would suggest, is a fairly good working definition of a communion.
So we've talked about Anglican, we've talked about communion. So what then is the Anglican Communion?
Well, and so to the crux of the matter. Well, having discussed what it means to be Anglican, what a communion is, as you say, it doesn't necessarily follow that combining those things gives you an easy definition of the Anglican Communion. The first definition, or rather statement of nature and status, was set out in 1930 through Resolution 49 of the Lambeth Conference. It begins by referring to the Anglican Communion as a fellowship within the Catholic Church. That resolution has been a de facto authority on Anglican identity, and I'll return to it in a minute. The report of the 1948 Lambeth Conference described the Anglican Communion in this way. It is like a river that is made up of streams, each of which passes through a different country, each with a different colour drawn from the soil through which it passes, each giving its best to the full strength of the river, flowing toward that ocean, symbolic of a larger comity, when the Anglican Communion itself will once again become part of a reunited Christendom. There is, if you'll excuse my pun, something inherently wishy-washy about that. Perhaps more helpful is the statement from the same conference that the Anglican Communion held a dispersed rather than a centralised authority. And there have been many attempts to find points of unity for churches of the Communion. The Lambeth Quadrilateral in 1888, the Appeal to All Christian People in 1930, the Windsor Report in 2004, and the Anglican Covenant proposal, to name a few. But in my view, the most successful of those is the creation and naming of the so-called instruments of communion. Those are the Archbishop of Canterbury as a focus of unity and historically primus inter pares, the Lambeth Conference of Bishops, the Primates Meeting, which is a gathering of metropolitan archbishops and presiding bishops founded only in 1978, and the Anglican Consultative Council, which is a body comprised of representatives from each member church, including, crucially, laypersons, which was founded in 1968. They are successful, I would say, because they serve to keep conversation and fellowship between the churches of the Communion, to create spaces for dialogue as well as for disagreement, essentially to commune together. It's a communion of churches, and through structural and constitutional agreement between the instruments, the constitution of the Anglican Consultative Council, the ACC, records what those member churches are and how, in broad terms, they are approved. There's presently 42 of them, which have been duly constituted and accepted. And it's these member churches which make up the Anglican Communion, and which express degrees of communion with each other to a greater or lesser extent. And recently we've seen some representatives of some of those churches refer to them being in impaired or broken communion with some others. Only recently, following a resolution of the ACC in 2018, has the Inter-Anglican Standing Commission for Unity, Faith and Order, IASCFO for short, worked to explore and propose a new statement of the nature and status of today's Anglican Communion. It did this in a published paper available freely online under the title of the Nairobi Cairo Proposals, with the intention of exploring whether the instruments of communion, which I've just mentioned, are fit for purpose, and to better prepare the structures so that the leadership of the communion should look like the communion. And as a consultant for that body, I commend the paper to you. IASCFO have emphasised the need for honesty in describing what the Anglican Communion is today. The proposals have been refined by further counsel and study, both internally and ecumenically, through consultation with the primates, and following open consultation and indeed critique from member churches and others. And the final proposals will be put to the ACC's 19th plenary session in Belfast at the beginning of July this year, when more details of those will be published. But for now, to answer the question that we have in front of us, I think it's sufficient to look at the proposed statement or definition in the published proposals as a narrow recasting of the 1930 statement. It reads, "The Anglican Communion is a fellowship within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of those duly constituted dioceses, provinces, or regional churches which have the following characteristics in common. They seek to uphold and propagate the Catholic and Apostolic faith and order as they're generally set forth in the Book of Common Prayer, as authorised in their distinct churches. They are autonomous and as such promote within each of their territories a local expression of Christian faith, life and worship. And they're bound together through their shared inheritance, mutual service, common council of bishops and others in conference, and historic connection with the See of Canterbury, by which they seek interdependently to foster the highest degree of communion possible, one with another." That definition, that statement reflects the reality that Anglicanism is constantly seeking to uphold the faith, affirming necessarily the autonomous nature of Anglican churches, and that there is nonetheless a mutuality which binds those churches together. Now, that is no longer about having full communion with the See of Canterbury, or indeed with each other, but it is about working towards the highest degree of communion possible. And if you give me one more quote, I can do no better than to conclude by quoting Archbishop Benson, who said, "Unity is not the first seen, but the last triumph of Christianity and man. Christ himself could not create unity in his church. He could pray for it, and his prayer most movingly teaches us to work for it. On earth, it is not a gift, but a growth."
Well, the Anglican Communion was being itself when I was in Bahrain last week at the Synod of Cyprus and the Gulf, and was greeting Bishop Julius of Thika in Kenya, because we have a three-way link, and I was just delighted to see him again. I think that was the Anglican Communion being. Thank you.